All right, guys. So now I'm going to look at the algorithm with you for adding and subtracting with unlike denominators. So we've kind of looked at using fraction tiles or fraction strips. We've talked about least common multiple and least common denominator. Now we're going to take all of it and kind of put it together to solve a problem. So this first problem is going to be 2/5 plus 1/2. The first step is finding that least common denominator. And so I'm going to walk you through all the steps. There's going to be some times when you get good at this that you're probably going to skip some of these steps. But since this is the first one, let's look at all of it together. So the very first step would be finding a least common multiple or least common denominator between a 5 and a 2. So I'm going to pull those out first. I'm going to start with my list here, and then I'm going to try to find my least common multiple. Well, when it comes to writing the first three facts for 5 and the first three facts for 2, I could definitely see or definitely tell that there's not an LCD here. What I could tell though is I think if I kept writing some of my 2's, I would eventually get to 10. And so my LCD is going to be 10 for 5 and 2. Okay, so there's your first step, is finding that LCD. So that step's out of the way, not too bad. The second step is going to be setting up your problem. Now, I teach it a certain way. Your teachers might teach it a little bit differently. But I like to teach it this way because I just think visually it's the easiest to see when you're going through it and you're trying to get a final answer. And so what I'm going to do is, instead of writing them going from left to right, I'm going to write it where I stack them on top of one another. So I'm going to really kind of set it up as a true addition problem. So I'm going to put 2/5 on top plus 1/2 underneath. And I'm going to go to work now showing how this changes from a 5th grade problem, and then how we're going to really try to change it back to a 4th grade problem. So I'm going to write this up above it so you can kind of just tell what I'm talking about here. So this is our 5th grade problem, 2/5 plus 1/2. Ideally, what you want to try to do to make your life easier, this is how I teach it, is you want to try to create that 4th grade problem. So next to it, I'm going to create a new problem. So I'm going to go ahead and draw fraction bars, but this time, instead of having fifths and halves, I'm going to have a common denominator of tenths, because that first step of finding our LCD is now going to come into play. We're now going to go find two fractions that are equivalent to 2/5 and 1/2 that will have the denominator of a tenth. So watch how this works. So this is probably the hardest step that a lot of kids struggle with, and that is, and again, it kind of just falls back on multiplication facts. So I'm going to look at just this top fraction here. This top fraction is 2/5. And so what I'm thinking in my mind is, okay, how do I get from 5 to 10? What multiplication fact am I thinking about there? Well, it's going to be times 2. Well, if you go back to equivalent fractions before Christmas break, if you're finding equivalent fractions, you can always multiply the numerator and denominator by the same number. In this case, if I do 2 times 2, I would get 4. So 4/10 is the same thing as 2/5. And you can tell by this picture that I provided up above that really these are equivalent fractions. They're the same thing. So now I'm going to go underneath and I'm going to do the same thing. Well, how do I get from 2 to 10? Well, that would be times 5. Well, if the denominator is times 5, the numerator can be times 5 as well. Well, 1 times 5 is 5. And so I'm going to get the fraction 5/10, which that one should make sense because by now, being in 5th grade, you should know your half fractions. So your half there, and if you're dealing with tenths, you know it has to be half of 10, so it's got to be 5. So 5/10 is going to be the same thing, and you can tell by that picture up above. So now what I want to do is, this is what I tell my students to do. I tell my students to draw like a box around this, because now I've created this 4th grade problem. And now when I look at this problem, I'm going to think to myself, I'm going back to fourth grade here because I have common denominators. And that's what you want. When you add and subtract fractions, you want a common denominator. So you have 4/10 plus 5/10. So essentially you just have 4 plus 5, which gives you 9. And then your tenth stays the same. And then you're asking yourself, is 9/10 simplified? It is. And so you have a final answer. 9/10 is it. So not too bad here. It's new. And it's going to take several, sometimes it takes quite a bit of these until you really figure out what you're doing. And you can't get frustrated with this. You just got to keep trying. So we're going to try a couple more. All right, this time I didn't provide a picture, but I'm going to go through the same steps. And so watch me on this problem. It's another addition problem. It's 1/3 plus 1/4. So I'm going to pull out my 3 and my 4. I'm going to start listing facts for both of them. And as I'm doing this, I'm looking for an LCD. Okay, I don't see it yet, but I think if I wrote another 3, it would be there. So 12 is going to be my least common denominator. All right, figured that out. Let's now stack them up. 1/3 plus 1/4. I'm going to make it to where I know in my mind what's going to happen. I'm going to recreate it, and I'm going to make a new problem. So I'm going to give myself some space to do this. And I'm going to say my new problem is now going to have 12ths as the denominator because 12ths is going to be common. All right, now I'm thinking multiplication facts here. What do I do to get from 3 to 12? Well, I would have to times it by 4. So if the bottom is times by 4, the top is times by 4. So it'd be 4 times 1, which is 4. So sometimes when I'm in class, I like to stop at this point and just remind kids what you're doing. You're finding equivalent fractions. 1/3 is the same as 4/12. If you drew them out or if you had fraction strips, you could find that. But you're not always going to have that. So you have to know how to do this algorithm. So you're finding those equivalent fractions so you can go add. And then the next one would be 1/4. All right, I'm thinking, how do I get from 4 to 12? I'll kind of draw an arrow here. Well, it would be times 3. Well, 1 times 3 is also 3. And so now I'm putting this box. That box is taking me back to fourth grade. I have common denominators. I'm going to add. 4 plus 3 is 7. 12 stays the same. 7/12 is my final answer. Can't do anything to 7/12. Can't simplify it. It is what it is. It's 7/12. All right, our last one here, 3/5 plus 2/3. Let's see what happens here. So I'm going to, again, pull out denominators. I've got 5s. So I'm going to list some 5s here. I've got 3s. Going to list some 3s. Don't have it, but I can probably keep going with my 3s and get it. Looks like my LCD is going to be 15 or 15ths in this case because it's a fraction. So I've got 3/5. I'm going to add 2/3. I've got 15ths as my LCD, least common denominator. And then I just go to work. So I'm going to think, all right, 5 times 3 gives me 15. 3 times 3 gives me 9. 3 times 5 gives me 15. 2 times 5 gives me 10. The only thing that's going to be different versus the first two, this is going to be something where we look at it and go, okay, well, now if I add, this is going to look a little bit different. And this is going to take us back to something that we did before break. If I look at this answer's an improper fraction. 19 is bigger than 15. And so 19/15, I'd have to sit there and think about what's my next step. And I'd have to change this into a mixed number. So I'm thinking, all right, 15, it can go into 19 one time. There would be 4 left over. And then my 15ths wouldn't change. I could draw it out in a house if I needed to. 19 divided by 15. And I could work it that way. But I'm going to get 1 4/15 as my answer. But then I'm looking at the fraction here, 4/15. Is there anything I can do to it? I don't think I can simplify 4/15. Nothing can go into both 4 and 15. So this is going to be my final answer. So a lot of this is practice and getting in that practice to be perfect at it. You got to do it, and it just takes some time. So look at these videos, rewatch them again. It would be the same thing for subtraction. I know I did all addition just then, but subtraction wouldn't be anything different. You'd still do the same steps, and then from there you would just be subtracting instead of adding.